Today, the Tea Party Summit. In our Fox Business studios, Sarah Palin, Ron Paul. Freedom Watch brings together leading libertarians.
We want our liberties back.
And social conservatives.
Freedom is worth fighting for.
Will these groups unite? What began with small rallies across the country is now changing American politics and maybe the future of our nation. Also with us today, trailblazers, icons, and organizers of this historic movement. Plus, Pennsylvania's outspoken Democratic Governor Ed Rendell is here to challenge everything the Tea Party stand for. But as governments around the world descend into bankruptcy, as people realize that the federal government cannot right every wrong and protect us from every catastrophe, the front line in the fight for the soul of the Tea Party movement is here on this show. That government is best which governs least. The Constitution was written to keep the government off the people's backs. Paul, Palin, now. A few quick thoughts from our Freedom File before we begin tonight's historic Tea Party Summit with our guests, former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin and Texas Congressman Ron Paul. The government keeps expanding. Does that make things better? Well, unemployment hovers around 10%. The stock market hovers around 10,000, just about where they were a decade ago. There has to be a better way. But the government's answer is more spending, over $1 trillion in bailouts, $2 trillion in so-called stimulus packages, and $1.5 trillion budget deficit in this year alone. Government spending now takes up nearly half of all our domestic economic activities. By this measure, we are halfway to socialism. Meanwhile, the government has troops stationed all over the globe at nearly 900 different permanent military bases and equips police here in the U.S. like soldiers in order to raid the homes of alleged drug users. Still, conventional wisdom is that trying to shrink popular government programs is like touching the dangerous third rail of American politics, producing howls of protest. Wait a minute, though. Lately, there are protests against government growth and against government spending. The Tea Party protests that have sprung up across America. Will the groups that make up this movement stay focused on the message of limiting government and slowing spending, or will differences over issues like religion, war, and immigration pull them apart? Let's find out. My first two guests are former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin. She's also a Fox News contributor, and Texas Congressman Ron Paul. Governor Palin, Congressman Paul, welcome here. Governor Palin, first to you. Will the Tea Party coalition stick together?
Absolutely. We have everything to lose if we don't hold together and help progress this nation, looking at smaller, smarter government to govern and not look to bigger government. That's what the Tea Party movement is all about. So, yes, it is in the nation's best interest for the Tea Party movement to stay together, to be banded together, united in the changes that we need to see take place in this country very quickly.
What is it that animates the Tea Parties? How is it that this movement has come about almost overnight in enormous numbers to challenge the orthodoxy of the government?
I think it's the recognition that government has failed. Big government has been around for a long time. Both parties have promoted it. But I think in the last few years it's been recognized that it's not working. People who even want the benefits are recognizing that, you know, the government's bankrupt, the country's bankrupt, and they're getting very afraid and frightened. So I think that is it. The failure of government is uniting all the people now who are so concerned about it.
Governor Palin, can we shrink big government, or are we stuck with big government forever?
We have to shrink the big government and the overreach that this intrusive Obama agenda is pressuring America to become. We have to. We have no choice. It's unsustainable what's going on right now, and we are on that path towards insolvency. So we have no choice. We have to shrink it. Some of our states and our conservative governors are trying exactly that on a more local level. Of course, it can be done, and it must be done.
The right to keep and bear arms, the right to defend yourself, is this a right that only belongs to the government or to state militias, or is this a natural right that belongs to every rational adult?
I don't think of rights belonging to the government. I believe rights belong to the individual. and not in groups. I don't like to think of collective rights, that people have rights because they belong to a group. No, the individual has a right to bear arms. But I don't even think you need that particular saying, because I think the right to own property should be enough to own and bear arms. But the Second Amendment and the Fifth Amendment means you have the right, and governments don't have the rights. They have some obligations to protect rights, but they don't have the right that would supersede our right as individuals to own.
Governor Palin, you're on the same page with Congressman Paul on this, are you not? The right to protect yourself by the use of a gun is an individual right, and the government can't interfere with it.
Absolutely, and thankfully our Constitution protects that. And as Congressman Paul is suggesting there, it's not our government or our Constitution that gives us our rights. It's our charters of liberty that protect our rights, including that right to protect ourselves via a gun if need be.
Governor Palin, should the federal government have any say whatsoever in abortion?
You know, I think that the government appropriately can have a say in abortion if you believe that a woman is pregnant with a child and that child has the right to life as endowed by our Creator. So I do believe that there is an appropriate role for government to have a say there in terms of protecting that soon-to-be-born child.
Do libertarians, Congressman Paul, recognize that the child in the womb is a growing person with the same rights as a person that's already been born?
Well, I think it depends on which libertarian you talk to. The Libertarian Party is even mixed on this, even though their platform endorses, abortion to a degree. But I think it is an act of violence. The fetus has legal rights. I, as a physician, if I do something wrong, I can be sued. If there's an accident and the fetus is killed, they're liable. Inheritance rights are there at conception. But acts of violence under our Constitution, I believe, we're always meant to be dealt with at the local level, at the state level. So I would like to keep the federal government out as much as possible. Obviously, no funding for abortion, but yes, the states have an absolute right. That's the reason I support the repeal of Roe versus Wade and allow the states to take care of the problems.
Governor Palin, does the federal government recognize any limits on its power, or does it act as if it can right any wrong, regulate any event, and enact any tax that it wants, the Constitution notwithstanding?
It's pretty pathetic that right now, under the Obama administration, there seems to be a disrespect for the limited enumerated powers that the Constitution mandates over our federal government. And that, too, is why the Tea Party movement is alive and well, and we're saying no more. There are limited powers via the Constitution that our federal government must adhere to. But, you know, libertarians, they advocate for the maximum liberty for thought and for action, and nobody can argue with that. What can be argued, though, appropriately with healthy debate is how can we protect, via the Constitution, those liberties and advocate for even more liberties in this country, while at the same time being able to appropriately allow government to govern according to the consent of the people, to provide services and some projects efficiently and effectively. The appropriate discussion there in debate is how can government play an appropriate role in providing those services.
But government can't protect us from everything. Government couldn't stop the oil from coming out of the earth in the Gulf of Mexico, even though the government told BP where to drill, and even though the government put caps on BP's liability. What role is there for government in a crisis like this?
Well, one thing is if they are obstructing, they ought to get out of the way. And in many ways, the federal government has obstructed. They have prevented property owners in the states to deal with some of the problems or the threat to their property. But the assumption is it's sort of this moral hazard that is involved when government grants the license and they're the regulators. People believe they're going to give us security, whether it's the SEC or the FDIC or safety in mines, or safety when they give a right to drill. It's not dealt with the market. The market might have demanded that there'd be more inspection. The insurance company might have been inspecting these properties and these mines and these drilling. And under those circumstances, maybe they would have required bonds to be put up. So I think you could have a lot more safety if it was dealt through with the marketplace rather than depending on the government regulators.
Governor Palin, your former colleague, Governor Bobby Jindal of Louisiana, had a plan to stop that oil from reaching the Louisiana beaches nearly 2 months ago, and the federal government wouldn't let him do it. Should he have gone ahead and done it anyway?
Heck yeah, they should have done it anyway, because we're talking about people's lives and livelihoods adversely affected by this tragedy in the Gulf. So yes, he should have done it and asked for forgiveness later. That's what I believe that is appropriate. But, you know, let me differ a little bit there with Congressman Paul on the regulatory need here for oversight of natural resource development. In Alaska, we learned very quickly with big oil companies that you can't just rely on their oversight. Their perception of situations and circumstances are certainly different than perhaps the public's perception of a situation like we're seeing in the Gulf right now. So in Alaska, we couldn't just trust that what they were telling us in terms of their regulations, in terms of their operating procedures or their measurements and standards were such that they didn't have to be verified. We had to set up our own offices in the state of Alaska to verify what they were telling us was true. And I think that there's been some lax oversight in the federal government under MMS, and that needs to change quickly. Otherwise, people are not going to trust that drilling can be done safely and responsibly.
Back to Governor Jindal and your advocacy that he should do the right thing. Can governors, can states nullify federal behavior when it violates rights like property rights and human rights and liberties of individuals?
If that is for me, governors for the most part understand the 10th Amendment to our Constitution and understand that local control is the best way to control and to govern effectively. So, you know, I don't know in the legal realm what Governor Jindal would be able to do and then perhaps not get sued by the federal government. But if there is a respect for the 10th Amendment in the Constitution, then yes, a governor, a local governing body should be able to have a lot more control than what we're allowed to have today under the Obama administration.
Congressman Paul, if the federal government wants to mandate something that is obviously against the Constitution, can the states refuse to comply? Stated differently, can they nullify federal behavior which is obviously harmful to property and freedom?
Well, they should, but they're not able to because the federal government comes down with a heavy hand right now. But it was intended. Jefferson obviously argued this case that they should. And I think that's what the whole Tea Party movement's about. Big government is failing. The federal government is collapsing. And now these laws are not going to be enforceable. When they run out of money, they won't even be able to pay for these programs. So I think it's going to be de facto nullification. And I think that's what the people have awakened to this. But the government in Washington, the people in Washington, don't even understand what's happening yet.
Governor Palin, Congressman Paul, stick with us. Ronald Reagan once said that the person who agrees with you 80% of the time is a friend, not 20% an enemy. So let's hear where the Tea Parties disagree. And later, Ron Paul's son, Senate candidate Dr. Rand Paul here on his cure for the movement's differences. We're back with former Governor Sarah Palin and Congressman Ron Paul. We're calling this the Tea Party Summit. Among some differences in the movement is foreign policy. Social conservatives among the Tea Party movement are generally hawks, and libertarians in the party are much more dovish. Governor Palin, can that be reconciled? Can those in this movement that think we should shoot first before they shoot at us be reconciled with those who think we shouldn't fight any wars unless we're attacked first?
Well, I believe that those who think we shouldn't engage in war unless we're shot at first don't understand what Ronald Reagan used to talk about peace through strength, that the best way to avoid a fight is to be prepared for a fight and to be more adamant to win that fight if we were to engage in it than the other guys. So, yeah, there can be reconciliation there if we go back to some time-tested truths that were espoused by Reagan and understand that we need to be prepared to fight.
Nobody questions that we need a Department of Defense, and we have to be prepared.
Defend our country if we're attacked. Like on 9/11, we should defend ourselves.
Do we need 900 permanent military installations around the world?
No, and it's coming to an end. I think this so-called disagreement that you're suggesting is irrelevant because we're broke. And all empires end, and we do have an empire. When you have 900 and some bases, 135 countries, and we're the policemen of the world, that comes to an end when you go broke, and we are broke, so the troops will come home. I'd like to just bring them home and save us from the bankruptcy. But no, they'll come home when the bankruptcy is declared, when the dollar doesn't function, and when there's such turmoil in the financial markets. We will come home.
We have legitimate allies, Congressman Paul, that we should be defending overseas because of their closeness to us, because they are democracies, like, say, for example, Israel.
No, I'd treat Israel like all the other countries, and I would say that we don't need bases in Germany, the Middle East, Japan, Korea, and they should be friends. We should take the advice of the founders. We should trade with them. We should travel. We should visit, be friends with them. But we don't get involved in their internal or their external squabbles, and we ought to just stay out of it, and it would be the best for America and best for the world.
If Israel is attacked, Governor Palin, should we be over there to defend it?
I think we should help defend Israel because the strong ally in the Middle East basically is our only ally over there. And for America's best interests, I think we need to be prepared to help defend Israel. I do agree with Congressman Paul, though, when he talks about an uninhibited empire building. No, we cannot engage in that, and our budget is not going to allow us to do that. But responsible engagement in some of these other parts of the world can lead to a safer world, a more peaceful world. As long as people realize that America can lead in this peace effort, and peace through strength, again, is what's going to be needed, I think it's responsible of us to be engaged in some other areas on the globe.
Governor Palin, switching gears, is it any business of the federal government if someone were to use a recreational drug in the privacy of their home in such a time and manner as not to harm another individual?
Well, if we're talking about pot, I'm not for the legalization of pot because I think that that would just encourage, especially our young people, to think that it's okay to go ahead and use it, and I'm not an advocate for that. However, I think that we need to prioritize our law enforcement efforts, and if somebody's going to smoke a joint in their house and not do anybody else any harm, then perhaps there are other things that our cops should be looking at to engage in and try to clean up some of the other problems that we have in society that are appropriate for law enforcement to do, and not concentrate on such a, relatively speaking, minimal problem that we have in the country.
Congressman Paul, should the police be breaking down doors with military equipment and shooting dogs and terrifying children in order to look for a minuscule remnant of marijuana in somebody's pipe in their bedroom?
Obviously not. We should legalize freedom of choice. A government can't protect individuals from themselves. We can aim to protect against harm against each other, but not what we do for or against ourselves. Everything that people say about marijuana and other drugs could apply to alcohol. Alcohol is the deadly drug, cigarettes. It's just a useless battle. I think the most magnificent thing was when they woke up one day and said prohibition of alcohol was an insane policy, and we're waking up right now. Just think of all the nullification about marijuana laws now, and the left is with us on that. Just nullify all those laws.
Governor Palin, you had a very unfortunate incident during the campaign where somebody hacked into your emails, and the guy was prosecuted and rightfully convicted, and the courts will handle that. Should the government be able to hack into your emails without a search warrant from a judge and on a whim?
Absolutely not, no, and that's an indication, those who would advocate for such a thing, an indication of how far we have strayed from our constitutional rights to liberty and freedom, and why we must fight with a unified Tea Party movement to make sure that government never strays that far from our Constitution to think that it's okay to hack into anybody's email, whether you're a government official or not.
You know, this was supposed to be the segment on which the Tea Party groups were going to disagree, and we keep finding some common ground. The Patriot Act,
that means,
which you were one of the few in the House to vote against, does let the federal government hack into people's emails and other private information without a search warrant from a judge. Is the Tea Party movement, Governor Palin, Congressman Paul, and all the other people involved, against that type of invasion of privacy?
Well, I don't think the two of us can speak for the whole Tea Party movement, but I think the Tea Party movement, if they're smart, they're going to get on board in saying, yes, we don't want our private email hacked into, which means that we aim to repeal the Patriot Act. So I think the people are waking up to this. Too much government, too much invasion of our privacy, too much control, and we need to repeal the whole mess.
Like any family, the Tea Party has some differences. And speaking of family, joining the conversation is one of the first big victories for the movement. Congressman Paul's son, Dr. Rand Paul, is here. He's the Republican candidate for the Senate from Kentucky, and he joins us right after this on the Tea Party Summit. With me are three politicians, each of whom is admired by at least some of the millions of Tea Party participants across America. Congressman and Dr. Ron Paul, former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin, and joining us now is Dr. Paul's son, Republican candidate for Senate from Kentucky, Dr. Rand Paul. Dr. Rand Paul, it is a tricky balancing act, is it not, for you to bring social conservatives and libertarians, those people whom your father has stirred the pot with, together behind your campaign? How do you do it?
So the interesting thing is I don't find that there's that much friction. When people ask me what's the Tea Party about, I say the top three issues are the debt, and the debt. It's all about government overspending. It's all about people who are worried and concerned about the future of the country. Governor Palin mentioned it earlier. Bernanke is now saying this. The deficit is unsustainable. That's a pretty potent word, unsustainable, and that's what the worry is about. But the issues I talk about do bring people together. Term limits are popular with everybody.
Right.
Balancing the budget by law is popular with everybody.
Right.
Making them read the bills is popular with just about everybody.
Right.
And making them enumerate where in the Constitution they get the power for the bills. If you put that up as a Tea Party platform, it'll be more popular than the contract with America.
Governor Palin, when you publicly endorsed the candidacy of Rand Paul, you took on, and you have a successful history of doing this, the establishment of the Republican Party, in this case in Kentucky. You ruffled some feathers, it didn't bother you. Why were you willing to do that? What is it about his candidacy that caused you to stick your neck out and endorse it against the hierarchy of the Republican Party?
Well, first I want to say hello to Rand and to remind him that, yeah, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it, if my name gets attached to your candidacy. And here you are being misconstrued by the lamestream media, and they taking things out of context when you want the opportunity to further explain your positions. And when I've seen this lately, I've just wanted to say, welcome to my world, Rand. But bless your heart, you're doing great. And he's willing to put it all on the line, Judge. That is why I respect and endorse Rand Paul. His libertarian views, too, which I so respect, are in great contrast to the overreach, intrusive government that is being shoved down our throat right now by the Obama administration. We need more Rand Pauls of the world to be willing to put it all on the line and be in a position to cast a vote to put us back on the right track to protect our Constitution.
Congressman Paul, were you surprised when a former member of the National Republican ticket, she ran for vice president a year and a half ago, stuck her neck out and opposed the party hierarchy to endorse an avowed libertarian like your son?
5 years ago, I'd have been totally shocked. I wouldn't have believed it. Today, things are changing. I've sort of anticipated, but I was still pleasantly surprised when she did it, and it made a big difference. So that's very good.
One of your colleagues, Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, a Republican from Southern California and a former speechwriter for Ronald Reagan, recently said that almost all Republican members of the House of Representatives now believe the Iraq War was a mistake. Do you agree with his assessment? And if so, how has there been such a sea change in thinking on the part of Republicans in government?
Yeah, I would think that he represents most of the people in Washington, but I think he represents the large majority of the American people. How long do people want to put up with a war that is a no-win war and just goes on and on and on? We've been in Afghanistan even longer. How long is it going to be until the people give up on that? So, no, that the people are really tired of it all.
Dr. Paul, what do you tell audiences in Kentucky when they ask you about what should we do with the war? Should we bring these troops home? Should we prosecute them more aggressively? Right. Do we belong there in the first place?
I'm not as bold as you or my dad, I think, on some of these issues, but I think there's sort of an in-between. Like, I talked to 100 GIs, and I know Governor Palin's son served in the military over there, but I talked to 100 GIs that were leaving for Afghanistan recently, and I just asked them a simple question. I said, I want to know from you, are we doing a good enough job, fast enough, to turn over patrolling of the streets to the local Afghanis? Just that simple question. Not do we come home precipitously, do we end it, but are we doing a good enough job turning it over to the local soldiers to patrol the streets? Every one of those GIs raised their hands, and their colonel was there with them. And they're patriotic young men, and the balancing act is we do need to support our young men and what they're doing, but at the same time we need to ask, is 10 years not too long for turning the process back over to the local Afghani soldiers?
Governor Palin, what argument would you make to suggest the following? The government has to stop printing money. The government can't keep putting us in debt. Debt is going to choke us, because I think Dr. Paul, the candidate for Kentucky Senate, is correct. That unites everybody in the Tea Parties.
It sure does. What unites us is this acknowledgement now that we are stealing from the future generations of Americans, this generational theft, which is immoral, it's unethical, it's not right, it should be illegal, that we are stealing opportunities from our children because we are paying for our wants and our needs today, and then we're expecting them to pick up the tab. And that's why fiscal conservatives and social conservatives and those strong on national security all together are under this umbrella of the Tea Party movement, because we're saying enough is enough. And I know that I have that social conservative label kind of stamped on my forehead right now, but I'm an independent, as so many Tea Party Americans are. I'm independent, and I'm happily registered within the GOP because I believe that the planks in that platform of that party can help build best our nation.
I see a great deal of unity here. I see people from all across the Tea Party movement fed up with the federal government, fed up with a government that thinks it can right any wrong and regulate any behavior and spend all the money it wants. And I also see a movement that's going to transcend the November elections. Governor Palin, Dr. Paul, Congressman Paul, thank you very much for being here today on Freedom Watch.